The evening sun was setting behind the trees as the black sedan moved smoothly down the quiet street. Inside the car, a man in his mid-40s sat behind the wheel, his shoulders relaxed after a long day of work. He had been looking forward to getting home, taking off his shoes, and having a quiet dinner. The neighborhood around him was peaceful, with large houses and well-kept lawns on both sides of the road. He had driven through this area many times before. It was a shortcut to his house, saving him nearly 15 minutes compared to the highway route. The street was lined with oak trees, and children's bicycles lay on some of the front yards. It was the kind of place where people felt safe, where they left their garage doors open and waved to neighbors. The man glanced at his watch. He would be home in 10 minutes if the traffic stayed light. He thought about the paperwork waiting for him tomorrow, and made a mental note to call his sister later that evening. She had been asking about his plans for the upcoming holiday weekend. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. The man's heart sank slightly, though he had done nothing wrong. He checked his speed. He was going 30 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. His seatbelt was fastened. His registration was current. He signaled and carefully pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to stop in a well-lit area near a street lamp. He put the car in park and turned off the engine. Then he did what he had learned to do years ago. He placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. He waited, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Through his side mirror, he watched as a police officer stepped out of the patrol car and walked toward him. The officer was a white man, probably in his early 30s, with a thick build and a stern expression. He approached the driver's side window with one hand resting on his belt. The man in the car rolled down his window slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Good evening, officer," the man said politely. His voice was calm and respectful. "May I ask why you stopped me?" The officer looked down at him with narrowed eyes. He did not return the greeting. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, peering into the car with obvious suspicion. "License and registration," the officer said flatly. There was no please, no explanation, just a command. "Of course," the man replied. "My license is in my wallet in my back pocket, and my registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them now, slowly." "Just get them," the officer snapped, his tone sharp and impatient. The man carefully retrieved his wallet, moving with exaggerated slowness. He pulled out his driver's license and held it up so the officer could see it clearly before handing it over. Then he reached across to the glove box, opened it gently, and took out the registration papers. The officer snatched both documents from his hand and studied them with a frown. He looked at the license, then at the man's face, then back at the license again. His expression suggested he was looking for something wrong, some discrepancy he could use. "This your car?" the officer asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes, sir, it is," the man answered. "Where are you coming from?" The officer's eyes moved over the interior of the car, scanning the seats and the dashboard as if searching for evidence of a crime. "I'm coming from work," the man said. "I'm heading home. Where do you work?" The officer's tone suggested he did not believe the answer he was about to hear. "I work at the military base about 20 minutes from here." The officer let out a short, mocking laugh. "The military base? Doing what exactly?" "I'm an officer there. I work in operations." The policeman's smirk widened. He shook his head slowly, as if he had just heard the most ridiculous lie. "Sure you do. And I'm the President of the United States." The man in the car said nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing in moments like this only made things worse. He kept his expression neutral, his hand still resting on the steering wheel. "You know what I think?" the officer continued, leaning down so his face was closer to the window. "I think you're driving through a neighborhood where you don't belong. I think maybe this car isn't really yours. I think maybe you need to explain to me what you're really doing here." "Officer, I've told you the truth. I live about 10 minutes from here. I drive this route every day after work. I haven't broken any traffic laws. Are you talking back to me?" The officer's voice rose slightly, taking on an aggressive edge. "I decide whether you broke the law or not. I decide if you're being suspicious, and right now you look pretty suspicious to me." The man forced himself to stay calm. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful, sir. I just want to understand why I was pulled over. I have a right to know." "You have a right?" the officer repeated, his voice mocking. "Let me tell you something about rights. Your rights are whatever I say they are when I'm standing here. You don't get to drive through this neighborhood in a fancy car and then tell me about rights." The man felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. He had experienced this before, though never quite this blatantly. He knew that showing emotion could be dangerous. He knew that one wrong word, one sudden movement, could turn this situation into something far worse. "I'm just trying to get home to my family," he said quietly. The officer straightened up and looked down the street, as if considering something. Then he pulled out his radio and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I need backup at my location. I've got a suspicious vehicle and an uncooperative driver." The man's eyes widened slightly. "Officer, I've been completely cooperative. I've answered all your questions. I haven't done anything wrong." "You're being uncooperative by questioning me," the officer shot back. "And I don't like your attitude. You're going to wait right here until my backup arrives, and then we're going to have a longer conversation about what you're doing in this neighborhood." The man sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He knew this was wrong. He knew his rights were being violated, but he also knew that challenging a police officer on a dark street could end badly. He thought about his family, about making it home safely. He thought about all the news stories he had seen, all the names he had heard. So he waited, hands on the wheel, while the officer stood outside his car with his arms crossed. In the distance, another siren began to wail, growing louder as it approached. The man closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. This was going to be a long night. The second patrol car arrived within minutes, its lights flashing bright against the darkening sky. Another officer stepped out, younger than the first, with a thin face and cold eyes. He walked over with the confident stride of someone who believed he had all the power in the world. The first officer met his partner halfway, and they spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing back at the car. The man inside could not hear what they were saying, but he saw the way they looked at him. He saw the way the second officer's mouth curved into a slight smile as the first one talked and gestured. After their brief conversation, both officers approached the vehicle. The man kept his hands visible, his expression calm despite the anxiety building in his chest. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer commanded. "May I ask why?" the man said carefully. "Because I told you to," came the sharp reply. "Are you refusing to follow a direct order from a police officer?" The man knew he had no real choice. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out onto the street. He stood with his hands at his sides, careful not to make any sudden movements. He was tall, well-built, and carried himself with natural dignity. But he knew that none of that mattered right now. "Put your hands on the hood of the car," the second officer instructed. The man complied, placing his palms flat on the warm metal of his car's hood. He felt hands patting down his sides, checking his pockets, running down his legs. It was humiliating, being treated like a criminal on a public street when he had done absolutely nothing wrong. "So you claim you work at the military base?" the second officer asked, his voice full of doubt. "Yes, I do." "Doing what exactly?" "Cleaning toilets?" The second officer laughed at his own joke, and the first officer joined in. The man said nothing. He stared straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. "I asked you a question," the second officer pressed, his voice hardening. "What do you do there?" "I'm an officer. I work in operations and procurement." Both officers burst into loud laughter. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood, drawing attention from nearby houses. The man saw curtains moving in windows. He saw a woman step out onto her porch, phone in hand. "An officer?" the first policeman repeated, still chuckling. "You? Let me guess, you're a general, right? Or maybe you're the one who runs the whole base." "I didn't say that. I said I'm an officer and I work in operations." "Sure you are," the second officer said mockingly. "And this car, did the military give you this? Or did you buy it with all that money you make cleaning floors?" The man's jaw clenched. Every word was designed to belittle him, to make him feel small. But he had spent decades in situations that required discipline and self-control. He would not lose his composure now. "The car is mine. I purchased it legally. Everything is in order." "We'll be the judge of that," the first officer said. He walked back to the patrol car and began speaking into his radio, probably running the plates and checking for warrants. The man knew they would find nothing. His record was spotless. The second officer circled the car slowly, looking through the windows with a flashlight even though there was still enough daylight to see clearly. He was performing, putting on a show for anyone who might be watching. You know what I think? The second officer said, loud enough for the small crowd that was beginning to gather. I think someone like you shouldn't be driving through neighborhoods like this. Makes people nervous. Makes them worry about their safety. A few people stood on the sidewalk now, some recording with their phones. The man could hear them murmuring, could feel their eyes on him. This was exactly what the officers wanted. Public humiliation. A lesson for anyone who might think they belonged somewhere they did not. I have every right to drive on this public street, the man said, his voice steady but firm. Rights again, the first officer said, returning from the patrol car. Your record is clean, I'll give you that. But that doesn't explain what you're doing here. People in this neighborhood, they pay good money for their houses. They work hard. They don't want trouble. I'm not trouble. I'm a citizen driving home from work. If you worked at the military base, you'd have some kind of ID, wouldn't you? The second officer challenged. Let's see it. My military ID is in my wallet, which is in my back pocket, the man explained. You have my wallet. You took it when you asked for my driver's license. The first officer pulled the wallet from his belt where he had clipped it. He opened it and flipped through the contents carelessly, letting some cards fall to the ground. The man watched his credit cards and family photos scatter on the pavement but said nothing. I don't see any military ID, the officer claimed. It's in the front pocket, in a plastic sleeve. The officer made a show of looking again, taking his time. Finally, he pulled out a card and glanced at it quickly before shoving it back into the wallet. This could be fake. Anyone can print an ID card these days. The second officer nodded in agreement. Lots of people pretend to be military. Stolen valor, they call it. That's actually a crime, you know. I am not pretending, the man said, his voice firm. Everything I've told you is the truth. The truth, the first officer repeated with a sneer. Let me tell you what I think is the truth. I think you came into this neighborhood looking to see what you could steal. I think that's why you're driving slow looking at houses. I think we stopped you just in time. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and false. The man felt his heart pounding but kept his voice level. That is completely untrue. I have never stolen anything in my life. We're going to search your vehicle, the first officer announced. If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind. Do you have probable cause for a search? The man asked. The officer stepped closer, his face inches away. I don't need to explain probable cause to you. I've got reasonable suspicion that you're involved in criminal activity. That's all I need. Now, are you going to cooperate or are we going to have a problem? The man knew his rights. He knew he could refuse. But he also knew what happened to people who refused. He thought about his family waiting at home. He thought about making it through this encounter alive. I want to cooperate, he said quietly. But I'm asking you to please contact your supervisor. I believe this stop is not based on any legitimate suspicion. My supervisor? The first officer laughed harshly. Let me tell you something. I don't need my supervisor's permission to do my job. I don't need anyone's permission. This is my town. These are my streets. I keep people safe here, and that means keeping an eye on anyone who looks like they don't belong. The words were clear enough. Anyone who looks like they don't belong. The man understood perfectly what that meant. I'm going to search your vehicle now, the officer continued. You're going to stand right here with Officer Davis while I do. If you move, if you try anything, it's going to go very badly for you. Do you understand? I understand. The man stood still while the first officer went through his car. He opened every door, checked under every seat, looked through the trunk. He pulled out the gym bag from the back seat and dumped its contents on the ground. Workout clothes, a towel, and a water bottle spilled onto the pavement. The crowd of onlookers had grown. At least 10 people stood watching now, some filming, some just staring. The man felt exposed, vulnerable, angry, but he kept all of those feelings locked inside, showing nothing on his face. After 15 minutes of searching, the officer found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. The car was clean. The man was innocent, but that did not seem to matter. The search had turned up nothing, but the officers were not finished. The man stood beside his car, watching as his belongings lay scattered across the ground. His workout clothes, his papers, his gym bag, all of it treated like garbage by men who seemed determined to prove something that was not true. More neighbors had come outside now. Some stood on their porches with arms crossed. Others had walked down to the sidewalk to get a better view. A few were clearly recording everything on their phones. The man could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the evening air. "What did he do?" someone asked. "I don't know. They just pulled him over," another voice answered. "He lives a few streets over, I think," a woman said. "I've seen that car before." The first officer slammed the trunk of the car shut with unnecessary force. He walked back to where the man stood with his partner, his face showing frustration at finding nothing incriminating. "Your car is clean," the officer admitted, though his tone suggested this was somehow suspicious in itself. "But that doesn't mean you're clean." "I've done nothing wrong," the man repeated for what felt like the 10th time. "I was simply driving home from work." "Yeah, so you keep saying," the second officer chimed in. "But here's the thing. We got calls about a suspicious vehicle in this area. Black sedan, just like yours, driving slow, looking at houses. So maybe you understand why we're taking this seriously." The man felt a flash of anger. He knew this was likely a lie. There had been no calls. This was just an excuse, a way to justify what they had already done. But he could not prove it, and arguing would only make things worse. "I drive this route every day," he explained again, keeping his voice calm. "I work at the base and I live nearby. Many people can confirm this." "Well, those people aren't here right now," the first officer said. "What is here is you in a neighborhood where you're making people uncomfortable," a voice called out from the small crowd. "He's not making me uncomfortable." It was an older white woman with gray hair, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed. "This is ridiculous. I've seen this man drive through here 100 times. He's never caused any problems." The first officer turned toward her, his expression darkening. "Ma'am, please step back. This is police business." "Police business?" she replied, her voice sharp. "This looks like harassment to me. Ma'am, if you interfere with this investigation, I will arrest you for obstruction. Please go back to your house." The woman looked like she wanted to say more, but a younger man beside her, probably her son, put a hand on her arm and whispered something. She shook her head in disgust, but stayed quiet. The officer turned back to the man. "See what you're doing? You're causing a disturbance in a peaceful neighborhood. You're making people come out of their houses. You're creating a scene." "I'm not creating anything," the man said firmly. "You pulled me over. You searched my car without cause. You've kept me here for almost an hour. I'm the one being disturbed." "Watch your tone," the officer warned, stepping closer. "I don't like your attitude. I don't like the way you're talking to me. I'm speaking respectfully and honestly. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't been aggressive. I'm simply asking to be treated fairly." The second officer laughed. "Treated fairly? You want fair? Here's what's fair. We're the police. We're here to protect this community. If we think someone is suspicious, we have every right to stop them and ask questions. That's our job. And I've answered every question," the man pointed out. "I've shown you my license. I've allowed you to search my vehicle. I've been cooperative in every way. What more do you want from me?" The first officer leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that only the man could hear. "What I want is for you to remember this. Remember that when you drive through neighborhoods like this, you need to be careful. You need to understand that people are watching. People who don't want trouble in their streets." The man met his eyes steadily. "I am not trouble. I'm a decorated military officer, a taxpayer, and a citizen who has every right to be on this public road." "Decorated officer," the cop repeated with a smirk. He raised his voice so others could hear. "This guy claims he's some big shot at the military base. Says he's an officer. Can you believe that?" Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few looked at each other with uncertain expressions. But the officers had planted the seed of doubt, making it seem like the man was lying about who he was. A younger black man in the crowd called out, "Why don't you check his ID then?" "He said he has military identification." The first officer whirled around. "Did I ask for your input? No? Then keep your mouth shut or you'll be next." The young man raised his hands and stepped back, but the anger on his face was clear. Others in the crowd began murmuring more loudly now. The mood was shifting. What had started as curiosity was becoming something else. People were starting to realize they were witnessing something wrong. The man took a slow breath and spoke carefully. "Officers, I'm asking again. Please call your supervisor. I want someone else here to see what's happening." "What's happening?" the second officer said loudly, addressing the crowd as much as the man, "is that we're doing our job. We're keeping this neighborhood safe. If people like you have a problem with that, maybe you should think about why." "People like you." The words hung in the air, impossible to misunderstand. A few people in the crowd gasped. An older black man shook his head and turned away as if he had seen this story too many times before. The man's phone, which was still in the car, began to ring. He could hear it through the open door. It rang 4 times, then stopped. A minute later it rang again. "That's probably my family," he said. "They're expecting me home. May I answer it and let them know I'll be late?" "No," the first officer said flatly. "You don't touch anything until I say you can. They'll be worried if I don't answer. That's not my problem." The phone rang a 3rd time, then stopped again. The man thought about his wife, probably standing in the kitchen, looking at her phone with growing concern. He thought about his children, wondering why their father was not home yet. The first officer pulled out a notebook and began writing. "I'm going to give you a citation," he announced. "For what?" the man asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "You found nothing wrong with my car. I haven't broken any laws." "Failure to signal when changing lanes," the officer said without looking up from his notepad. "I didn't change lanes. I've been driving straight down this road." "I saw you drift," the officer insisted. "That's a traffic violation, and I'm also citing you for failure to properly display your registration." "My registration is properly displayed. You saw it yourself. It's right there on the windshield." "It's not visible enough," the officer claimed. "It needs to be more clearly displayed." The man realized what was happening. They had found nothing, so now they were inventing violations. They wanted to punish him, to make sure he understood his place, and there was nothing he could do about it without making things worse. "Fine," he said quietly. "Write your citations." "Then may I leave?" The officer took his time writing, making sure the man stood there as long as possible. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The crowd began to thin as people grew bored or uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. But several remained, their phones still pointed at the scene. Finally, the officer tore the citations from his notebook and thrust them toward the man. "Here, sign at the bottom." The man took the papers and read them carefully. Both citations were completely fabricated. He had done none of the things they claimed. But he signed them anyway, because refusing would mean arrest, and arrest would mean jail, and jail could mean danger he was not willing to risk. "Am I free to go now?" he asked after signing. The first officer looked at him for a long moment as if considering whether to find some other reason to detain him. Then he stepped back and waved his hand dismissively. "Get out of here, and remember what I said. Be careful where you drive." The man gathered his belongings from the ground, putting them back in his car as both officers watched. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. Everything about this had been wrong. Every moment had been a violation of his rights and dignity. He got back into his car and started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, he looked in his rearview mirror. The 2 officers stood in the street watching him go. One of them said something to the other and they both laughed. The man drove slowly, carefully, following every traffic law perfectly. His heart was pounding. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. And in his mind, he was already planning what he would do next, because this was not over. Not by a long shot. The man drove the rest of the way home in silence, his mind processing everything that had just happened. The streets passed by in a blur as darkness fully settled over the neighborhood. His phone rang again. This time he pulled over safely and answered it. "Where are you?" His wife's voice was tight with worry. "I've been calling for 30 minutes. "I'm okay," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I was pulled over. I'll be home in 5 minutes. I'll explain everything then." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm sure. I'll be home soon." He ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of his car. He looked at the citations lying on the passenger seat. Failure to signal, improper registration display. Both were lies. Both were violations he had not committed, but they were written on official paper, signed by officers with badges and guns. When he pulled into his driveway, the front door opened before he could even turn off the engine. His wife stood there, silhouetted in the light from inside, her face creased with concern. He got out slowly, picking up the citations and his scattered belongings. "What happened?" she asked as he reached the door. He told her everything while they sat at the kitchen table. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing harder with each detail. When he finished, she reached across and took his hand. "This is wrong," she said quietly. "This is completely wrong." "I know. What are you going to do?" He looked down at the citations again, reading the names printed at the bottom. Officer J. Mills, Officer R. Davis, Precinct 14. He committed every detail to memory. "I'm going to do something," he said, "but I need to think about it carefully. I need to do this the right way." His wife nodded. She knew him well enough to understand that when he spoke like this, he had already begun forming a plan. That night, the man could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the traffic stop in his mind. The mockery, the disrespect, the way they had treated him like a criminal, like someone who did not deserve basic dignity, the way they had laughed when he told them his rank. At 5 in the morning, he got up and went to his home office. He pulled out a file from his desk drawer. Inside were documents he had organized over the years, certificates, commendations, letters of appreciation from senior military officials and government leaders. He looked through them, reminding himself of who he was and what he had accomplished. Then he turned on his computer and began writing. He documented everything from the previous night in careful detail. The time, the location, the names of the officers, every word they had said, every action they had taken. He wrote it all down while it was still fresh in his memory. When he was finished, he sat back and read through what he had written. It was damning. It was clear. And it was the truth. At 7 o'clock, he showered and dressed in his uniform. The dark blue service uniform with its crisp lines and polished buttons. The insignia on his shoulders showing his rank. The ribbons on his chest representing years of service, deployments, commendations, and sacrifices. He looked at himself in the mirror and straightened his tie. His wife appeared in the doorway. "You're wearing your uniform to work today?" "Yes," he said. "I want to remember who I am today. I want everyone else to remember too." She walked over and adjusted his collar slightly, then looked up at him with eyes that held both pride and worry. "Be careful. I will." The drive to the base took 20 minutes. He passed through the same neighborhood where he had been stopped, driving carefully, aware of every movement. No patrol cars appeared this time. At the base entrance, the young guard on duty snapped to attention and saluted sharply. "Good morning, Colonel." The man returned the salute. "Good morning, Sergeant." He drove through the gates and parked in his designated spot near the headquarters building. As he walked through the corridors, junior officers and enlisted personnel stepped aside and saluted. He returned each salute with practiced precision, acknowledging their respect. His office was on the 3rd floor, a spacious room with windows overlooking the parade ground. The walls were lined with photographs, military flags, and framed certificates. His desk was large and organized with neat stacks of papers and folders. His adjutant, a young captain who had served with him for 3 years, was already at her desk in the outer office. She stood when he entered. "Good morning, sir. I wasn't expecting you this early." "Good morning, Captain. I need you to pull some files for me." "Of course, sir. Which files?" "I want everything we have on our community partnership programs, specifically any documentation about federal funding we provide to local police departments. I want to see budget allocations, grant approvals, and oversight reports for the past 3 years. The captain's eyebrows rose slightly. "All of it, sir?" "All of it. And I want it on my desk within the hour." "Yes, sir." She turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. She knew better than to ask questions when he used that tone. The man went into his office and closed the door. He sat at his desk and pulled up the base directory on his computer. He found what he was looking for quickly. The base legal office, the public affairs office, the inspector general's office. He would need all of them. His phone rang. He answered it immediately. "This is Colonel Johnson," said a familiar voice. Johnson was a colleague, another senior officer who worked in a different department. "I heard you came in early. Everything okay?" Word traveled fast on a military base. "I'm fine, thanks. Just have some work to catch up on." "Fair enough. Are we still on for the staff meeting this afternoon?" "Yes, I'll be there." "Good. See you then." The man hung up and leaned back in his chair. He pulled open his desk drawer and took out the citations from the previous night. He laid them on his desk and stared at them, feeling the anger rise again, but he pushed it down. Anger would not help him now. He needed to be calm, methodical, and precise. There was a knock on his door. "Come in," he called. The captain entered with a thick stack of folders. "Here are the files you requested, sir. I've organized them by year and by precinct." "Excellent work, Captain." "Thank you." She set the folders on his desk and hesitated. "Sir, if you don't mind my asking, is everything all right?" He looked up at her. She had been a good officer, loyal and competent. She deserved an honest answer. "Something happened last night," he said. "Something that shouldn't have happened. I'm looking into it." She nodded slowly. "If you need any assistance, sir, please let me know." "I will. Thank you, Captain." When she left, he opened the first folder. Inside were detailed reports about federal grants administered through the base. Money provided to local police departments for equipment, training, and community programs. The funding was substantial, running into millions of dollars each year. He flipped through page after page until he found what he was looking for. Precinct 14. The same precinct whose officers had stopped him last night. According to the documents, Precinct 14 received over $2 million annually through various federal programs. Much of that money was distributed through the base as part of the military's effort to maintain good relationships with the surrounding communities, and the approval process for those funds went through his department. The man smiled grimly. He had not been entirely honest with those officers last night. He had told them he worked in operations. That was true. But he had not told them exactly what kind of operations. He had not told them that he was one of the senior officers responsible for community liaison and resource allocation. He had not told them that he had significant influence over which local agencies received funding and which did not. They had laughed at him. They had mocked his rank. They had treated him like he was nothing. Now they would learn who he really was. He picked up his phone and dialed an internal number. The call was answered on the second ring. "Legal office, Major Peterson speaking." "Major, this is the Colonel. I need to schedule a meeting with you and your staff this afternoon. I have a legal matter that requires immediate attention." "Of course, sir. What time works for you?" 1400 hours. "We'll be ready, sir." He made 2 more calls, one to the Public Affairs Office and one to the Inspector General. Then he sat back and looked at the folders spread across his desk. This would not be easy. It would require careful planning, proper documentation, and following the correct procedures. But he had spent his entire career learning how to navigate complex situations. He knew how systems worked. He knew how to use the proper channels to achieve the proper results. Those officers had made a serious mistake last night. They had assumed he was powerless. They had assumed he had no recourse. They had assumed wrong. The man opened his computer and began drafting a formal complaint. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, setting into motion a process that would change everything. The meeting with the legal office lasted 2 hours. The man sat across from Major Peterson and 2 other military attorneys, laying out everything that had happened the previous night. He presented his documentation, the false citations, and his detailed written account of the traffic stop. Major Peterson listened carefully, taking notes throughout. When the man finished, the attorney sat back and removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly while he thought. "Sir, this is clearly a case of discriminatory treatment and abuse of authority," Peterson said. "The question is how you want to proceed. We have several options. I want to file a formal complaint," the man stated, "and I want to understand what leverage we have regarding the funding we provide to their department." The attorney nodded. "That's where things get interesting. As you know, Precinct 14 receives substantial federal funding through our community partnership programs. That funding is contingent on the department meeting certain standards, including non-discrimination policies and professional conduct requirements, which they clearly violated last night." "Agreed. And you have the authority, as the senior officer overseeing these programs, to recommend changes to funding allocations based on compliance issues." The man leaned forward. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "We can file the formal complaint today. I'll draft it this afternoon with all your documentation. Then we need to notify the appropriate civilian authorities. The town's mayor, the police chief, and the city council should all be informed. We'll also file with the Federal Oversight Office that monitors these grants. How long before they respond? That depends on how seriously they take it. If they understand the funding implications, I'd say within a week. If they try to ignore it or delay, we can accelerate the timeline by scheduling a mandatory review meeting. The man thought for a moment. Schedule the review meeting regardless. I want this addressed quickly and properly. Yes, sir. I'll begin the paperwork immediately. After the legal meeting, the man went to see the base's public affairs officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harris. Harris was a sharp woman in her early 40s who had handled media relations for the base for 5 years. I heard you had an interesting night, Harris said as he entered her office. The man was not surprised. News traveled fast in military circles. You could say that. I also heard you're filing a formal complaint and possibly reviewing funding allocations. That's correct. Harris nodded approvingly. Good. Those officers stepped way over the line. But I need to prepare you for something. When word gets out about this, and it will get out, there's going to be media attention. Some of it will be supportive. Some won't be. I understand. Do you want me to prepare a media strategy? The man considered this. He had not planned to make this a public matter. He had hoped to resolve it through proper channels without drawing attention. But Harris was right. Once the complaint was filed and the funding review began, people would notice. Questions would be asked. Not yet, he said. Let's see how the local authorities respond first. If they handle it properly, maybe we can keep this relatively quiet. If they don't, then we'll need your help. Fair enough. But I'm starting preliminary work now, just in case. I want to be ready. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. His final meeting of the day was with the Inspector General's office. The IG was responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct and ensuring compliance with regulations. The man spent an hour with the lead investigator, going through his account in even greater detail. This is troubling, the investigator said. We take any allegations of discrimination against our service members very seriously. I'm opening a formal investigation as of right now. What does that involve? We'll interview witnesses, review any video evidence from the scene, and examine the officers' records for patterns of similar behavior. We'll also coordinate with the civilian authorities, though we maintain our own independent investigation. Several people were filming, the man recalled. The videos might be online by now. We'll look into that. Social media can actually be helpful in cases like this. It provides independent documentation of events. When the man left the IG's office, it was late afternoon. He returned to his own office and found his adjutant waiting with a message. Sir, Major Peterson from legal called. He said the complaint is drafted and ready for your review. He's sending it to your email now. Thank you, Captain. He sat at his desk and opened the email. The complaint was thorough and professional, laying out the facts without emotion or exaggeration. It detailed the discriminatory treatment, the false citations, the public humiliation, and the clear violation of his civil rights. It also noted that the officer's conduct reflected poorly on a department that received substantial federal funding. The man read through it twice, made a few minor edits, and then signed it electronically. With a click, he filed the official complaint. There was no taking it back now. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his wife. How's your day going? He typed back. Moving forward. I'll tell you everything tonight. The next morning, the man arrived at his office to find his adjutant looking slightly nervous. Sir, you've received several calls this morning. The mayor's office called twice. The police chief called once. And someone from the city council called. Already? He checked his watch. It was only 8 o'clock. Apparently, the complaint reached them late last night. They seem very concerned. I'll bet they are. Did they leave numbers? Yes, sir. And they all requested meetings as soon as possible. The man smiled slightly. Tell them I'm available tomorrow afternoon. Set up a meeting at the base conference room. 2 o'clock. Invite the mayor, the police chief, and any city council members who want to attend. Also make sure Major Peterson and Lieutenant Colonel Harris are there. Yes, sir. Should I tell them what the meeting is about? They already know. But if they ask, tell them we're discussing the community partnership program and certain compliance issues that have arisen. The captain nodded and went to make the calls. The man sat at his desk and pulled up his computer. He had received several emails overnight, including one from the Federal Oversight Office acknowledging receipt of his complaint. He also noticed something else. His adjutant had forwarded him a link to a social media post. He clicked on it and found a video with the caption, "Police harassment caught on camera." The video was from the previous night. Someone had filmed the entire traffic stop from across the street. The man watched himself standing beside his car, hands visible while the officers searched through his belongings. He heard their mocking voices, their dismissive comments. He watched them laugh when he mentioned being a military officer. The video had been posted 10 hours ago. It already had 50,000 views and hundreds of comments. "This is disgusting," one comment read. "He was so calm and respectful, and they treated him like dirt," said another. "Does anyone know who this man is? Someone should help him," asked a third. The man closed the video. He felt exposed, seeing himself in that vulnerable position for the whole world to see. But he also felt validated. Here was proof, independent proof of exactly what had happened. His phone rang. It was Major Peterson. "Sir, have you seen the video? I just watched it. It's spreading fast. Local news stations are starting to pick it up. This is going to be bigger than we thought." "I see that. The good news is that it completely supports your account. Everything you documented is visible in that video. The bad news is that you're about to become a public figure in this story." The man took a breath. "Lieutenant Colonel Harris warned me about this. Let's stick to the plan. We handle tomorrow's meeting professionally. We let the facts speak for themselves." "Understood, sir." That evening, as the man drove home, he took a different route. He did not want to drive through the neighborhood where he had been stopped. Not yet. Not until this was resolved. At home, his wife met him at the door with her tablet.
"Have you been online today?"
"A little. Why?" "Everyone is talking about this. The video's everywhere. People are calling for those officers to be fired." He took the tablet and scrolled through the comments and shares. The story had taken on a life of its own. People were outraged. They were demanding accountability. Some had even identified him as a military officer, though his rank had not been confirmed publicly yet. "This is getting complicated," he said quietly. His wife took his hand. "Maybe, but sometimes complicated is necessary. Sometimes things have to get uncomfortable before they get better." He squeezed her hand. "Tomorrow I meet with the mayor and police chief. That's when we'll see if they're serious about making this right. And if they're not, then things will get even more complicated." The next day moved slowly. The man attended his regular meetings, handled his normal duties, and tried to focus on work. But his mind kept drifting to the afternoon meeting. Everything he had set in motion was about to come to a head. At 1:30, Major Peterson arrived at his office with a briefcase full of documents. At 1:40, Lieutenant Colonel Harris joined them with her own files. They reviewed the strategy one more time. "Remember," Peterson said, "we're not here to make threats. We're here to present facts and discuss compliance issues. The funding implications will become clear without us having to spell them out." "Understood," the man said. The conference room was silent as everyone took their seats. The man sat at the head of the table with Major Peterson on his right and Lieutenant Colonel Harris on his left. Across from them sat the mayor, the police chief, and the 2 city council members. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The man placed a folder on the table in front of him, but did not open it yet. He looked at each person in turn, his gaze steady and professional. "Gentlemen, councilwoman," he began, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. I know this was arranged quickly, and I'm sure you're all busy, but we have a serious matter to address." The mayor cleared his throat nervously. "Colonel, I want to start by saying that we've reviewed the complaint you filed, and I want to apologize on behalf of the city for what happened to you." "I appreciate that, Mayor," the man said calmly, "but I need more than an apology. I need to understand how something like this could happen in the first place." The police chief shifted in his seat. He was a large man with a square jaw and eyes that did not quite meet the colonel's gaze. "Sir, I've spoken with Officers Mills and Davis. They claim they had legitimate reasons for the traffic stop." "Legitimate reasons?" The man's voice remained level but held an edge. "Tell me, Chief, what were those legitimate reasons?" The chief consulted a paper in front of him. They reported receiving calls about a suspicious vehicle in that neighborhood. "A black sedan matching your car's description." "I see. And do you have records of these calls?" The chief hesitated. "We're still pulling those records, which means you don't have them," the man stated. It was not a question. Major Peterson leaned forward. Chief, we've already requested those call records through our official channels. Your department has 48 hours to produce them. If they exist, the chief's jaw tightened. Are you suggesting my officers lied? I'm not suggesting anything, the man said. I'm stating facts. Your officers pulled me over without cause. They searched my vehicle without probable cause. They issued false citations for violations I did not commit. And they did all of this while making it very clear that they stopped me because of the color of my skin. One of the city council members, a woman in her 60s, spoke up. Colonel, we've all seen the video. It's disturbing. The way they spoke to you was completely inappropriate. Inappropriate, the man repeated. That's one word for it. Racist would be another. Illegal would be a third. The mayor held up his hands. Colonel, please understand. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior in our police department. This is not who we are as a community, isn't it? The man opened his folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. Because I did some research. In the past 3 years, your department has had 17 formal complaints filed against it for racial profiling. 17. Of those complaints, how many resulted in disciplinary action? The room was silent. I'll tell you, the man continued. 2. And those resulted in written warnings, nothing more. So when you say this isn't who you are, the evidence suggests otherwise. The police chief's face had turned red. Those complaints were investigated and found to be without merit in most cases. Investigated by whom? Major Peterson asked. Your Internal Affairs Department? The same department that reports directly to you? That's standard procedure, the chief protested. Standard, perhaps, but not sufficient. The man pulled out more documents. Let me share something else with you. Your precinct receives approximately $2.3 million annually in federal funding. This money comes through various programs, many of which are administered or overseen by this military base. My department specifically. The mayor's face went pale. Colonel, the funding for our police department is critical. We rely on those federal grants for equipment, training, community programs. I'm aware of what the funding covers. The man interrupted smoothly. And that funding is contingent on your department meeting certain federal standards. Standards that include non-discrimination policies, proper training protocols, and accountability measures. We meet all those standards, the chief insisted. But his voice lacked confidence, do you? The man slid a document across the table. This is a compliance review from last year. Your department barely passed. There were multiple areas of concern noted by the federal reviewers. Those concerns were supposed to be addressed. Were they? The chief picked up the document and scanned it, his expression growing darker. I'll take your silence as a no, the man said. Which brings us to the current situation. 2 of your officers engaged in clear racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of authority against a senior military officer. This incident was captured on video and has now been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people. It reflects not only on your department, but on the base's relationship with the community, and it raises serious questions about whether your department should continue receiving federal funding. You're threatening to cut our funding? The mayor's voice rose with panic. I'm not threatening anything, the man said firmly. I'm explaining the reality of the situation. Federal funds come with federal requirements. When those requirements aren't met, the funding is reviewed. That's not a threat. That's policy. One of the city council members, a younger man who had been silent until now, leaned forward. Colonel, what would it take to resolve this situation? What do you want from us? The man appreciated the direct question. I want accountability. I want those 2 officers to face real consequences for their actions. I want a thorough, independent investigation into the discriminatory practices in your department. And I want systemic changes that will prevent this from happening to anyone else. That seems reasonable, the council member said, looking at the police chief. The chief's expression was stony. With all due respect, sir, you're asking me to throw my officers under the bus based on one incident. One incident? The man's voice hardened. Chief, did you not hear what I just said about 17 complaints in 3 years? This is not one incident. This is a pattern. And your refusal to acknowledge that is part of the problem. The mayor jumped in quickly. Chief, I think what the colonel is saying makes sense. We need to take this seriously, very seriously. If I may, Lieutenant Colonel Harris spoke for the first time. This situation is already public. The video has been shared widely. Media outlets are covering it. Our base has received inquiries from national news organizations. How you handle this now will determine not only your department's future funding, but also your community's reputation. The chief slumped slightly in his chair. The fight seemed to drain out of him as he realized the position he was in. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. The man folded his hands on the table. "First, Officers Mills and Davis need to be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. Second, that investigation needs to be conducted by an independent third party, not your internal affairs department. Third, the results of that investigation need to be made public. Fourth, your department needs to implement mandatory bias training for all officers. And fifth, you need to establish a civilian oversight board with real authority to review complaints." That's a lot, the chief said. "It's necessary," the man replied. "And it's non-negotiable if you want to maintain the base's support and federal funding." The mayor looked at the chief, then back at the colonel. "We'll do it, all of it. But we need time to implement these changes properly." "You have 60 days to show substantial progress," Major Peterson said. "We'll schedule a follow-up review at that time. If the progress is insufficient, the funding recommendations will be adjusted accordingly." 60 days isn't much time, one of the council members said. "Then I suggest you start immediately," the man said. He stood and everyone else rose with him. "Gentlemen, Councilwoman, I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this out of anger or revenge. I'm doing this because it's right. Because if this can happen to me, a senior military officer, then it can happen to anyone. And it probably has happened to many others who didn't have the resources or position to fight back." The mayor nodded slowly. "We understand, Colonel. And again, I apologize for what happened to you." "Don't apologize to me," the man said. "Apologize to your community by making sure it never happens again." He picked up his folder and walked toward the door. Major Peterson and Lieutenant Colonel Harris followed. As they left, the man heard the mayor's voice rising, already arguing with the police chief. Outside the conference room, Peterson turned to him. "That went as well as we could have hoped, sir." "It's a start," the man said. "But we need to follow up. I want weekly reports on their progress. I'll make sure of it." The man returned to his office and sat at his desk. His phone buzzed with a message from his wife. "How did it go?" He typed back, "They agreed to everything. Now we wait and see if they follow through." An hour later, his adjutant knocked on the door. "Sir, you have a call from the local newspaper. They're asking for a comment on the incident." The man thought for a moment. He had avoided media attention so far, letting the facts speak for themselves. But perhaps it was time to put a voice to those facts. "Transfer the call," he said. When the reporter came on the line, her voice was respectful. "Colonel, thank you for taking my call. I'm working on a story about what happened to you. Would you be willing to comment?" "I'll give you a brief statement," he said. "This incident was about more than just me. It was about systemic problems in how some law enforcement agencies treat people of color. I'm in a position to demand accountability, but many people aren't. That's why real change is necessary. Not just apologies, but concrete actions that prevent this from happening to others." "Have the police department and city officials agreed to make changes?" "They have committed to several measures, including independent investigations, bias training, and civilian oversight. Whether they follow through remains to be seen. I'll be monitoring the situation closely. Will you continue to push for those officers to be fired?" "I'll let the investigation run its course. But I will say this. Officers who abuse their authority and discriminate against citizens have no place in law enforcement." "Thank you, Colonel. This has been very helpful." When he hung up, the man felt a strange sense of relief. He had set things in motion. He had used his position and authority to demand accountability. Now he had to trust that the system would work the way it was supposed to. That evening, as he drove home, he deliberately took his usual route. The same streets where he had been stopped. The same neighborhood where he had been humiliated. He drove slowly, carefully, following every law exactly. No police cars appeared. No lights flashed behind him. He made it home without incident, but he knew this was only the beginning. Real change would take time, effort, and constant vigilance. He was prepared for all of that, because some fights were worth fighting no matter how long they took. The next several weeks moved quickly. The man maintained his regular duties at the base while keeping a close watch on the progress in town. True to their word, the mayor and city council had moved swiftly. Officers Mills and Davis were suspended within 24 hours of the meeting. An independent investigator, a former federal prosecutor with experience in civil rights cases, was hired to conduct the review. The man received weekly updates from Major Peterson. The investigation was thorough and revealing. The independent investigator had interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed body camera footage from other stops, and examined years of police records. What she found was damning. Officers Mills and Davis had a clear pattern of targeting minority drivers. In the past 18 months alone, they had made over 40 traffic stops in which they cited reasons nearly identical to those used in the Colonel's case. Suspicious vehicle, suspicious behavior, failure to signal, improper registration display. And in almost every case, the driver was black or Latino. But the investigation revealed something even more troubling. Other officers in the department had similar patterns. The culture within Precinct 14 had quietly encouraged racial profiling for years. Officers who made good stops were praised by certain supervisors. Those who questioned these practices were sidelined or transferred. The investigator's report was released to the public on a Tuesday morning. The man read it at his desk, feeling both vindicated and saddened. Vindicated because everything he had claimed was proven true, saddened because it confirmed that many others had suffered similar treatment. His phone rang almost immediately. It was the mayor. "Colonel, have you seen the report?" "I'm reading it now. It's worse than I thought." The mayor's voice was heavy. "I had no idea things were this bad." "With respect, Mayor, that's part of the problem. You should have known." The signs were there. The complaints were filed. But no one was really paying attention. There was a long pause. "You're right. And I take responsibility for that, which is why I'm calling to let you know that we're taking immediate action." "What kind of action?" "Officers Mills and Davis are being terminated, effective immediately. 3 other officers with similar patterns are also being let go, and Chief Morrison has submitted his resignation." The man sat back in his chair. He had expected consequences, but this was more than he had anticipated. "The chief is resigning?" He didn't have much choice. The report made it clear that he either knew about these practices or should have known. Either way, he failed in his duty to supervise his officers and maintain proper standards. The city council met last night and made it clear his position was no longer tenable. "I see. We're also moving forward with all the other recommendations you made. Bias training starts next month. We've established a civilian oversight board with 7 members from the community, and we're implementing new policies for traffic stops, including mandatory body cameras and stricter reporting requirements." "That's good to hear, Mayor. I want you to know something, Colonel. When you first filed your complaint, I thought you were overreacting. I thought maybe the officers had just made a mistake, had a bad day. But the investigation showed me how wrong I was. What happened to you wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem. And if you hadn't stood up, if you hadn't demanded accountability, we might never have addressed it." The man felt the weight of those words. "Thank you for saying that." "No, thank you. Thank you for having the courage to fight this. And thank you for using your position to create real change." When the call ended, the man sat quietly for a moment. He thought about the other names in the report. People who had been stopped, searched, humiliated, just as he had been. People who had filed complaints that went nowhere. People who had given up on the system because the system had failed them. At least now, maybe things would be different. That afternoon, the base held a community forum in the main auditorium. It had been planned weeks earlier as part of the regular military community outreach program, but the timing was significant. The man had been asked to speak. The auditorium was packed. Military personnel filled the front rows, but behind them sat hundreds of civilians from the surrounding communities. The man recognized many faces, including the elderly woman who had spoken up for him during the traffic stop. When it was his turn to speak, he walked to the podium in his dress uniform. The room fell silent. "Good afternoon," he began. "For those who don't know me, I'm a senior officer here at the base. I've served in the military for over 20 years. I've deployed overseas multiple times. I've led troops in combat. I've received commendations and awards. And a few weeks ago, I was pulled over, harassed and humiliated by police officers who saw only the color of my skin." He paused, letting the words settle. "I could have stayed silent. I could have accepted the false citations and moved on with my life. After all, I made it home safely that night, which is more than some people in my position can say. But I didn't stay silent, because silence allows injustice to continue. Silence tells those who abuse their power that they can keep doing it without consequences. He looked out at the audience, seeing people nodding in agreement. I'm fortunate. I have rank. I have authority. I have resources. I was able to fight back in ways that many people cannot. But that's exactly why I had to fight. Because if this can happen to someone like me, it can happen to anyone, and it has happened to many others. A young man in the audience raised his hand. The colonel nodded to him. Sir, what message do you have for other people who've experienced this kind of treatment? People who don't have the same resources you do? The man thought carefully before answering. I would say this: document everything. If you're pulled over, remember names and badge numbers. If it's safe to do so, record what happens. File complaints through official channels even if you think nothing will come of it. And most importantly, don't lose hope. Change is possible. But it requires people to speak up, to demand accountability, to refuse to accept injustice as normal. An older black woman stood up. Colonel, I want to thank you. My son was pulled over by those same officers 2 years ago. They searched his car, they humiliated him. They made him feel like a criminal when he was just trying to get to work. He filed a complaint, but nothing happened. When I saw what you did, when I saw that you got them to take action, I cried. Because finally someone made them listen. The woman's voice cracked with emotion. The room was silent except for a few people wiping their eyes. The man's own throat tightened. Ma'am, I'm sorry your son went through that. And I'm sorry his complaint wasn't taken seriously. But I promise you things are changing. Not as fast as they should, but they are changing. And we all have to keep pushing until justice isn't just for some people, but for all people. The applause was immediate and sustained. People stood clapping, some cheering. The man saw tears on many faces, including military personnel who had likely experienced similar treatment. When the forum ended, dozens of people approached him. Some wanted to shake his hand. Others wanted to share their own stories of discrimination. A few just wanted to say thank you. He stayed for over an hour, listening to each person, acknowledging their experiences, offering what encouragement he could. Finally, as the crowd thinned, the elderly woman from the traffic stop approached. She smiled at him warmly. When the reporter came on the line, her voice was respectful. Colonel, thank you for taking my call. I'm working on a story about what happened to you. Would you be willing to comment? I'll give you a brief statement, he said. This incident was about more than just me. It was about systemic problems in how some law enforcement agencies treat people of color. I'm in a position to demand accountability, but many people aren't. That's why real change is necessary. Not just apologies, but concrete actions that prevent this from happening to others. Have the police department and city officials agreed to make changes? They have committed to several measures, including independent investigations, bias training, and civilian oversight. Whether they follow through remains to be seen. I'll be monitoring the situation closely. Will you continue to push for those officers to be fired? I'll let the investigation run its course. But I will say this. Officers who abuse their authority and discriminate against citizens have no place in law enforcement. Thank you, Colonel. This has been very helpful. When he hung up, the man felt a strange sense of relief. He had set things in motion. He had used his position and authority to demand accountability. Now he had to trust that the system would work the way it was supposed to. That evening, as he drove home, he deliberately took his usual route. The same streets where he had been stopped. The same neighborhood where he had been humiliated. He drove slowly, carefully, following every law exactly. No police cars appeared. No lights flashed behind him. He made it home without incident, but he knew this was only the beginning. Real change would take time, effort, and constant vigilance. He was prepared for all of that, because some fights were worth fighting no matter how long they took. The next several weeks moved quickly. The man maintained his regular duties at the base while keeping a close watch on the progress in town. True to their word, the mayor and city council had moved swiftly. Officers Mills and Davis were suspended within 24 hours of the meeting. An independent investigator, a former federal prosecutor with experience in civil rights cases, was hired to conduct the review. The man received weekly updates from Major Peterson. The investigation was thorough and revealing. The independent investigator had interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed body camera footage from other stops, and examined years of police records. What she found was damning. Officers Mills and Davis had a clear pattern of targeting minority drivers. In the past 18 months alone, They had made over 40 traffic stops in which they cited reasons nearly identical to those used in the colonel's case. Suspicious vehicle, suspicious behavior, failure to signal, improper registration display, and in almost every case the driver was black or Latino. But the investigation revealed something even more troubling. Other officers in the department had similar patterns. The culture within Precinct 14 had quietly encouraged racial profiling for years. Officers who made good stops were praised by certain supervisors. Those who questioned these practices were sidelined or transferred. The investigator's report was released to the public on a Tuesday morning. The man read it at his desk, feeling both vindicated and saddened. Vindicated because everything he had claimed was proven true. Saddened because it confirmed that many others had suffered similar treatment. His phone rang almost immediately. It was the mayor. "Colonel, have you seen the report? I'm reading it now. It's worse than I thought." The mayor's voice was heavy. "I had no idea things were this bad." "With respect, Mayor, that's part of the problem. You should have known. The signs were there. The complaints were filed. But no one was really paying attention." There was a long pause. "You're right, and I take responsibility for that. Which is why I'm calling to let you know that we're taking immediate action." "What kind of action?" "Officers Mills and Davis are being terminated, effective immediately. 3 other officers with similar patterns are also being let go, and Chief Morrison has submitted his resignation." The man sat back in his chair. He had expected consequences, but this was more than he had anticipated. "The chief is resigning?" He didn't have much choice. The report made it clear that he either knew about these practices or should have known. Either way, he failed in his duty to supervise his officers and maintain proper standards. The city council met last night and made it clear his position was no longer tenable. "I see. We're also moving forward with all the other recommendations you made. Bias training starts next month. We've established a civilian oversight board with 7 members from the community, and we're implementing new policies for traffic stops, including mandatory body cameras and stricter reporting requirements." "That's good to hear, Mayor. I want you to know something, Colonel. When you first filed your complaint, I thought you were overreacting. I thought maybe the officers had just made a mistake, had a bad day. But the investigation showed me how wrong I was. What happened to you wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem. And if you hadn't stood up, if you hadn't demanded accountability, we might never have addressed it." The man felt the weight of those words. "Thank you for saying that." "No, thank you. Thank you for having the courage to fight this. And thank you for using your position to create real change." When the call ended, the man sat quietly for a moment. He thought about the other names in the report. People who had been stopped, searched, humiliated, just as he had been. People who had filed complaints that went nowhere. People who had given up on the system because the system had failed them. At least now, maybe things would be different. That afternoon, the base held a community forum in the main auditorium. It had been planned weeks earlier as part of the regular military community outreach program, but the timing was significant. The man had been asked to speak. The auditorium was packed. Military personnel filled the front rows, but behind them sat hundreds of civilians from the surrounding communities. The man recognized many faces, including the elderly woman who had spoken up for him during the traffic stop. When it was his turn to speak, he walked to the podium in his dress uniform. The room fell silent. "Good afternoon," he began. "For those who don't know me, I'm a senior officer here at the base. I've served in the military for over 20 years. I've deployed overseas multiple times. I've led troops in combat. I've received commendations and awards. And a few weeks ago I was pulled over, harassed and humiliated by police officers who saw only the color of my skin." He paused, letting the words settle. "I could have stayed silent. I could have accepted the false citations and moved on with my life. After all, I made it home safely that night, which is more than some people in my position can say. But I didn't stay silent. Because silence allows injustice to continue. Silence tells those who abuse their power that they can keep doing it without consequences." He looked out at the audience, seeing people nodding in agreement. "I'm fortunate. I have rank. I have authority. I have resources. I was able to fight back in ways that many people cannot. But that's exactly why I had to fight. Because if this can happen to someone like me, it can happen to anyone, and it has happened to many others." A young man in the audience raised his hand. The colonel nodded to him. Sir, what message do you have for other people who've experienced this kind of treatment? People who don't have the same resources you do? The man thought carefully before answering. I would say this: document everything. If you're pulled over, remember names and badge numbers. If it's safe to do so, record what happens. File complaints through official channels, even if you think nothing will come of it. And most importantly, don't lose hope. Change is possible, but it requires people to speak up, to demand accountability, to refuse to accept injustice as normal. An older black woman stood up. Colonel, I want to thank you. My son was pulled over by those same officers 2 years ago. They searched his car. They humiliated him. They made him feel like a criminal when he was just trying to get to work. He filed a complaint, but nothing happened. When I saw what you did, when I saw that you got them to take action, I cried. Because finally someone made them listen. The woman's voice cracked with emotion. The room was silent except for a few people wiping their eyes. The man's own throat tightened. Ma'am, I'm sorry your son went through that. And I'm sorry his complaint wasn't taken seriously. But I promise you things are changing. Not as fast as they should, but they are changing. And we all have to keep pushing until justice isn't just for some people, but for all people. The applause was immediate and sustained. People stood, clapping, some cheering. The man saw tears on many faces, including military personnel who had likely experienced similar treatment. When the forum ended, dozens of people approached him. Some wanted to shake his hand. Others wanted to share their own stories of discrimination. A few just wanted to say thank you. He stayed for over an hour, listening to each person, acknowledging their experiences, offering what encouragement he could. Finally, as the crowd thinned, the elderly woman from the traffic stop approached. She smiled at him warmly. I never did introduce myself properly, she said. I'm Margaret Chen. I'm the one who yelled at those officers that night. The man laughed. I remember. Thank you for speaking up. I've lived in this town for 40 years, she said. I've seen things get better in some ways and worse in others. What those officers did to you, it reminded me of things I saw in the 60s and 70s. I thought we had moved past that. I was wrong. We haven't moved past it yet, the man agreed. But maybe we're moving toward it. Because of people like you, she said, patting his arm. Don't stop fighting, Colonel. I won't. Over the following weeks, the changes in town became visible. The new police chief, a woman with a strong background in community policing, began implementing reforms immediately. Officers received training, not just on bias and discrimination, but on de-escalation, cultural competency, and constitutional rights. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first meeting and immediately began reviewing past complaints that had been dismissed. The man continued to receive updates. The department's behavior had shifted noticeably. Traffic stops were down, complaints were down, and community relations were slowly improving. It would take time to rebuild trust, but the foundation was being laid. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 months after the initial incident, the man was driving through the same neighborhood where he had been stopped. He was taking his daughter to a friend's birthday party. She sat in the passenger seat chattering about school and friends. As they drove down the familiar street, a police car appeared behind them. The man's hands instinctively tightened on the wheel. His daughter noticed. Dad? Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. The patrol car followed them for several blocks. The man checked his speed, his signals, everything. He was doing nothing wrong, but his heart still raced. Then the patrol car turned off onto a side street and disappeared. The man let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Dad, you were scared, his daughter said quietly. She was 13, old enough to understand some things, but young enough that he still tried to protect her from others. A little, he admitted. Because of what happened before? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. My friend Jasmine says her dad won't drive through certain neighborhoods because he's afraid of getting stopped. She says it happens a lot to black people. The man pulled over and turned to face his daughter. It does happen a lot. Too much. But that's why we work to change things. That's why I did what I did, so that maybe by the time you're old enough to drive, things will be better. Will they be? He wanted to promise her that they would. He wanted to say that racism would be gone, that discrimination would be history. that she would never have to experience what he had experienced, but he could not lie to her. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but they'll be better than they are now. Because people are fighting to make them better. And when you're older, you can be one of those people too." She nodded slowly, processing this. Then she smiled at him. "You're brave, Dad." "Thank you, baby girl." They drove the rest of the way to the party, talking about lighter things. But the man thought about what she had said. Brave. He didn't feel particularly brave. He had simply refused to accept injustice. He had used the tools and position available to him to demand accountability. But maybe that was what bravery looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear stop you from doing what was right. Several months later, the man received an invitation to speak at a national conference on police reform. The organizers had heard about what happened and the changes that resulted. They wanted him to share his experience with law enforcement leaders from across the country. He accepted. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of police chiefs and officers, he told his story again. But this time, he focused on what came after. The investigation, the accountability, the reforms, the slow, difficult work of changing a system. "The officers who stopped me that night saw me as a threat," he said in closing. "They saw my skin color and made assumptions. They saw me driving in a nice neighborhood and decided I didn't belong. They let their biases override their training and their duty. But here's what they didn't see. They didn't see that I serve my country. They didn't see that I have a family who loves me. They didn't see that I'm a human being deserving of respect and dignity. And that's the real problem we need to solve. Not just training officers to follow proper procedures, but helping them see the full humanity in every person they encounter." The response was mixed. Some in the audience nodded vigorously. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked skeptical. But they were listening. They were engaged. And that was a start. After the conference, several officers approached him with questions and stories of their own. They wanted to know how to implement similar changes in their departments. They wanted advice on dealing with resistance from within their ranks. They wanted to do better. The man shared what he had learned, emphasizing that change required leadership. From the top, accountability at all levels and a genuine commitment to serving all members of the community equally. One evening, nearly a year after the initial incident, the man sat in his home office reviewing the latest reports from town. The reforms were holding. Complaints were way down. Community trust was slowly rebuilding. Officers Mills and Davis had never worked in law enforcement again. The former police chief had left town entirely. His wife came in and sat on the edge of his desk. "Still working?" "Just reviewing some reports." She picked up one of the folders and flipped through it. "This is quite a legacy you've created." "I don't know about legacy. I just did what needed to be done." "That's exactly what a legacy is," she said softly. "Doing what needs to be done even when it's hard. Even when people don't want you to. You changed things. Not just for yourself, but for everyone." He thought about all the people he had met over the past year. The mother whose son had been harassed. The young man who was afraid to drive in certain areas. The children who were learning that they could stand up against injustice. The officers who were learning to do better. "I hope so," he said. "I know so." Years later, the man would sometimes drive through that same neighborhood. He would pass the spot where he had been pulled over, where he had been humiliated, where everything had changed. And he would remember, not just the anger and fear of that night, but what came after. The courage to stand up, the refusal to stay silent, the power of using one's position to protect others, the slow, difficult, necessary work of creating change. And he would think about the child he had waved to once, the one standing in the yard, watching. He hoped that child had grown up in a community that was just a little bit better, a little bit fairer, a little bit more just than it had been before. Because that was worth fighting for. That was always worth fighting for.